What do narcissistic people do when they know they are guilty? Not when they are accused unfairly or when there is general confusion, but when they know exactly what they did. They know the evidence exists and they know they have been caught. The answer surprises many people because most assume that guilt naturally leads to accountability. Stick with me here because this is where everything you think you know about human behavior flips upside down. With narcissistic patterns, guilt does not lead to an apology. It leads directly to strategy. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, denial is almost always the very first response you will see. This is not the same as an ordinary person denying a mistake out of sudden fear, embarrassment, or a momentary inability to face a blunder. In narcissistic patterns, denial serves a much deeper, more calculated purpose. Admitting wrongdoing immediately threatens the fragile image they have carefully built of themselves as superior, admirable, competent, or morally right. Because that false image is so incredibly important to them, accepting responsibility can feel entirely intolerable. As a result, they will boldly reject facts that seem completely obvious to everyone else in the room, even when confronted with clear evidence, screenshots, text messages, audio recordings, or direct witness accounts. They may continue insisting that the event never happened or that you are completely mistaken. What makes this behavior so deeply confusing is the absolute confidence with which it is delivered. Most people assume that someone confronted with undeniable proof will eventually break down and acknowledge reality. Instead, the narcissistic person doubles down. They speak with absolute certainty and conviction, even when the truth is standing directly in front of them. They are not focused on finding an accurate understanding of what happened. Their attention is entirely laser focused on avoiding shame, preserving control, and protecting their manufactured self-image. If admitting guilt feels like a threat to their identity, denial becomes a defensive shield. Over time, this can leave the people around them feeling deeply frustrated, confused, and emotionally exhausted. You might begin wondering whether you explained yourself poorly or whether more evidence is needed. Yet the problem is rarely a lack of evidence. The denial continues because accepting the truth would require the narcissistic person to face responsibility. And that is often the very thing they are trying hardest to avoid. When absolute denial is no longer working, a narcissistic person who knows they are guilty often moves to the next strategic phase, which is rewriting history. This is one of the most maddening experiences for anyone dealing with narcissistic behavior because it can make you question events that once seemed completely clear in your mind. Rather than admitting what occurred, they begin altering the narrative in subtle or dramatic ways. Conversations are suddenly remembered differently. Promises are instantly denied. Important details disappear into thin air, and entirely new explanations appear that were never mentioned before. The ultimate goal here is not necessarily to create a believable version of events. The goal is to create enough chaos and uncertainty that accountability becomes nearly impossible to achieve. A narcissistic person will take an incident that was completely straightforward and transform it into something far more complicated. If they lied, they will claim they were misunderstood. If they broke an agreement, they will insist no agreement ever existed in the first place. If they said something deeply hurtful, they will argue that their words were taken out of context. Facts that make them look responsible are minimized, while trivial details that make them appear innocent are massively exaggerated. Over time, the original event becomes completely buried beneath layers of revision and reinterpretation. What makes this tactic especially effective is that most compassionate people naturally assume that memory differences are normal. Because of this, they often give the narcissistic person the benefit of the doubt. They may revisit old conversations, replay situations in their mind, and wonder whether they remembered things incorrectly. This creates instant confusion and shifts attention away from the actual bad behavior. Instead of discussing what actually happened, the entire discussion becomes a debate about whose version of reality is correct. By changing the narrative, the narcissistic person protects their image and reduces the likelihood of being held responsible for their actions. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, blame shifting often becomes one of their most powerful weapons. Instead of addressing their own behavior, they immediately redirect attention towards someone else, usually the person confronting them. The exact moment accountability enters the conversation, the focus begins to move away from what they did and toward what you supposedly did wrong. This shift can happen so quickly that many people do not even realize it is occurring until the conversation is over. What started as a necessary discussion about their dishonesty, betrayal, disrespect, or manipulation suddenly becomes an intense discussion about your personal flaws, mistakes, reactions, or shortcomings. For example, if you confront them about lying, they may accuse you of being way too suspicious. If you bring up a broken promise, they may criticize the harsh way you communicated your concerns. If you point out hurtful behavior, they may remind you of a mistake you made months or even years ago. The original issue becomes completely lost in a maze of accusations and distractions. Instead of explaining their actions, they place you in a position where you feel compelled to defend yourself. This tactic works perfectly because it creates emotional confusion. Most people enter difficult conversations expecting both sides to discuss the problem honestly. When blame is suddenly redirected toward them, they become defensive and begin explaining or justifying themselves. The narcissistic person benefits immensely from this shift because attention is no longer focused on their behavior. The conversation changes from an examination of their actions to an examination of yours. Over time, repeated blame shifting can make a person feel responsible for problems they did not create. You may start believing that if you had acted differently, the narcissistic person's behavior would not have occurred. In reality, blame shifting is never about finding the truth. It is entirely about escaping responsibility by placing the heavy burden of guilt onto your shoulders. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, gaslighting becomes far more intense because it serves as a way to protect them from accountability. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which someone repeatedly causes another person to doubt their own perceptions, memories, judgments, and basic understanding of reality. Rather than addressing the issue directly, the narcissistic person attempts to make you question whether the issue actually exists at all. This can be especially confusing because it does not always happen through obvious, blatant lies. Often it occurs through persistent contradiction, subtle dismissal, and constant distortion of events. You may clearly remember a specific conversation, a promise, or a concrete action that took place. The narcissistic person will insist that it never happened, that you totally misunderstood what was said, or that you are remembering it incorrectly. If you provide physical evidence, they will attack the way you interpreted the situation rather than addressing the evidence itself. They might tell you that you are too sensitive, too emotional, overreacting, or imagining problems that do not exist. The discussion gradually shifts away from their bad behavior and toward your psychological ability to perceive reality accurately. What makes gaslighting particularly damaging is that it works slowly over time. A single disagreement may not have much impact, but repeated exposure can create massive, paralyzing self-doubt. You may start replaying conversations in your mind constantly, second-guessing your memory, and seeking reassurance from others about events you once felt completely certain about. The more uncertain you become, the easier it is for the narcissistic person to maintain total control of the narrative. For the narcissistic person, gaslighting is a brilliant way to avoid responsibility without ever directly admitting fault. If they can convince you to question your own reality, then they no longer have to defend their actions. The focus moves away from what they did and on to whether your perception of the situation can be trusted at all. And if this explanation is helping you make sense of experiences that once felt impossible to understand, hold on, because we are about to look at the most surprising reaction of all. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, one of the most shocking reactions is their sudden tendency to position themselves as the victim. This can be deeply confusing because the person who caused the actual harm suddenly begins acting as though they are the one who has been horribly wronged. Instead of focusing on the pain, disappointment, or consequences experienced by others, they skillfully redirect attention toward their own emotional distress. The conversation gradually shifts away from accountability and toward intense sympathy for them. This victim stance can take many forms. They may talk about how overwhelmed they feel, how much pressure they are under, or how unfairly they are being treated by everyone. They might describe themselves as misunderstood, attacked, judged, or persecuted. In some cases, they may even suggest that confronting them about their behavior is actually more hurtful than the bad behavior itself. The original issue becomes completely overshadowed by their emotional reaction to being held responsible. What makes this tactic so effective is that many people are naturally compassionate. When someone appears distressed, most individuals instinctively want to comfort them, understand them, and reduce their suffering. A narcissistic person takes full advantage of this empathetic tendency by shifting the emotional spotlight entirely onto themselves. Instead of discussing the damage they caused, everyone ends up discussing their feelings about being confronted. Over time, this pattern can create a toxic cycle in which accountability becomes nearly impossible to achieve. Every single attempt to address a problem is met with stories about their struggles, their pain, or their hardships. The person who was harmed may even begin feeling guilty for bringing up legitimate concerns. You may find yourself apologizing, backing down, or minimizing your own experiences just to restore peace in the relationship. By adopting the role of the victim, the narcissistic person completely avoids the uncomfortable task of examining their own behavior. Attention, sympathy, and emotional energy are redirected toward them, allowing responsibility to fade into the background, while their need for protection and validation remains at the very center of the interaction. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, protecting their public image often becomes a much higher priority than addressing the actual harm they caused. This leads directly to what can be called an image management campaign. Rather than focusing on repair, they focus entirely on controlling how other people perceive the situation from the outside. Because narcissistic individuals frequently rely on admiration, approval, status, or reputation to maintain their fragile sense of self, public exposure can feel deeply threatening. If their behavior becomes known to the wider circle, the carefully constructed image they present to the world may be permanently damaged. This defensive process often happens completely behind the scenes. They may begin talking to friends, family members, co-workers, or mutual acquaintances before you even realize it is occurring. Instead of giving a balanced account of the conflict, they selectively share information that supports their version of events. Important context is intentionally omitted. Your emotional reactions are highly highlighted, while their initial actions are minimized, and details that make them look responsible disappear entirely. Sometimes they do not even need to tell obvious lies. They simply present a partial story that creates a highly favorable impression of themselves. A common feature of image management is preemptive framing. If they suspect they may be confronted or exposed, they will quietly establish themselves as the reasonable, misunderstood, or injured party before others ever hear the full story from you. This can make it incredibly difficult for the person who was harmed to be believed later, because people have already been given a convincing narrative that casts the narcissistic person in a positive light. The emotional impact on you can be significant. You may discover that close friends seem to know a very different version of what happened. Relationships can become strained, and you may feel completely isolated or misunderstood. The narcissistic person benefits from this confusion because maintaining external validation helps protect their identity and reduces the social consequences of their behavior. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, deflection becomes one of their most effective methods for avoiding accountability. Unlike blame shifting, which redirects responsibility onto someone else specifically, deflection works by moving attention away from the core issue altogether. The goal here is not necessarily to prove innocence. The goal is to prevent the conversation from staying focused on the behavior that needs to be addressed. If the discussion never remains on the original topic long enough, meaningful accountability becomes impossible to achieve. Deflection can take many creative forms. A narcissistic person may suddenly change the subject entirely when confronted with uncomfortable facts. They may bring up an unrelated problem from the past, introduce a brand new conflict, or focus on a completely different event. If you ask a direct question, they may respond with something only loosely connected to what was asked. Instead of discussing their actions, they create noisy distractions that pull the conversation in multiple directions at once. Before long, the original concern becomes completely buried beneath side issues and emotional detours. What makes deflection particularly frustrating is that it can appear quite reasonable on the surface. The new topics they introduce may sound important, and the concerns they raise may even contain some truth. However, the timing is what truly matters. These issues always emerge precisely when attention is focused on their bad behavior. As a result, the discussion becomes scattered and completely unproductive. Many people do not recognize deflection immediately because they enter conversations expecting cooperation and genuine problem solving. They naturally follow the new topic, hoping to resolve every issue that is raised. Hours later, you may realize that the original problem was never addressed at all. The conversation feels completely exhausting, yet nothing meaningful has been accomplished. For the narcissistic person, deflection serves as a perfect shield against accountability. By constantly redirecting attention, they prevent sustained examination of their actions and create enough confusion to avoid facing the consequences of what they have done. When a narcissistic person knows they are guilty, one of the most confusing reactions can be the sudden appearance of charm, kindness, affection, or even what seems like genuine remorse. After denying, blaming, gaslighting, or avoiding responsibility, they may unexpectedly become warm, attentive, and deeply apologetic. For someone who has been hurt by their behavior, this sudden shift can feel like a massive breakthrough. It may seem as though they have finally recognized the damage they caused and are truly ready to make things right. However, understanding the underlying motivation behind this behavioral shift is absolutely essential. In healthy relationships, apologies are always connected to self-reflection, deep empathy, and a sincere desire to repair harm. The person acknowledges what they did, accepts responsibility, and demonstrates change through consistent actions over time. A narcissistic person, however, uses charm and apologies primarily as a temporary strategy to reduce consequences, regain control, or restore access to a relationship that is slipping away. The focus is always on ending the immediate conflict rather than understanding the deep impact of their behavior. They will say exactly what the other person has been longing to hear for months. They may express profound regret, promise total change, become unusually attentive, or temporarily behave in ways that feel incredibly loving and reassuring. This creates a powerful sense of hope and makes the injured person believe that meaningful transformation is finally taking place. The emotional relief that follows can be overwhelming, especially after a long period of intense tension or confusion. The key difference lies in what happens after the apology. If the underlying attitudes and behaviors remain exactly unchanged, the cycle repeats itself. The charm fades away, old patterns return, and new excuses emerge when problems arise again. In these situations, the apology functions less as a commitment to growth and more as a tool for restoring stability, protecting self-interest, and avoiding the lasting consequences that genuine accountability would require. When narcissistic people know they are guilty, their reactions reveal something highly important. Their primary focus is never repairing the damage they have caused, but protecting themselves from the discomfort of accountability. Whether it is denial, rewriting history, blame shifting, gaslighting, playing the victim, managing their image, deflecting conversations, or suddenly becoming charming and apologetic, each behavior serves the exact same underlying purpose: to avoid facing responsibility and preserve their manufactured self-image at all costs. Understanding these patterns is not about labeling every difficult person in your life as a narcissist or becoming hyper-suspicious of everyone around you. It is about recognizing behaviors that keep you trapped in endless confusion, self-doubt, and futile attempts to get someone to acknowledge what happened. The more clearly you see these patterns, the less power they have over you. You do not need another person's permission to trust your own experiences. You do not need endless explanations to validate what you know is true. And you do not need someone else's accountability in order to establish your own boundaries. Real healing often begins when you stop chasing the admission, apology, or understanding you have been hoping for, and start focusing entirely on your own clarity, self-respect, and emotional well-being. The greatest defense against manipulation is never winning an argument. It is seeing the pattern for what it is. Because once you can recognize these behaviors without getting pulled into them, you become far less vulnerable to their influence. And that is exactly where real freedom begins. Not when they finally admit what they did, but when their refusal to do so no longer controls your peace of mind.